hello to everyone, and I'm delighted and honoured to join you this evening to tell you about Calverley Old Hall and the Landmark Trust's restoration there, which is currently well underway on site. As many of you will know, the Landmark Trust is a national buildings at risk charity, and since 1965 we've been taking on buildings that really can't survive without us, restoring them to the highest standards, and then giving them a financially secure future by letting them for self-catering holidays. And so this particular end use is what drives all our restorations. We have no endowment as a charity, and so these days we must raise the money for each of our restoration through donations and grants. And as you see, the current restoration of Calverley Old Hall has had an enabling grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. I know that Calverley Old Hall will be well known to some of you from the 1980s, but not at all familiar to others. So I hope everyone will find something of interest in the next 40 minutes or so. It's not going to be a particularly technical talk because, quite honestly, the building is so big, there would be too much material for that. But I will be sharing our latest reinterpretation of the phasing of the grouping. And with the luxury of permission to open up and the use of the very latest timber dating techniques, this has changed significantly since the interpretation since the 1980s. I'll explain this phasing in the context of a very potted history of this complicated site, highlighting a few of the people who shaped it within the context of national events. And finally, I'll also be sharing some very intriguing on-site discoveries with you. So here is the old hall within its wider landscape, by now on the very northwest edge of Leeds, but still feeling very much like a village. The site itself has evolved since at least the mid-12th century, from a tiny rural settlement then. And you can see how modern development has enveloped it on all sides now. And it's quite easy to pass by on the Woodhall Road almost without noticing. The whole site has been owned by Landmark since 1981, when it was bought by our founder, John Smith. In those days, Smith's private trust fund enabled acquisition by purchase, but that's no longer the case for Landmark today. However, Smith recognised the importance of this ancient manor house and bought it to prevent it being sold as separate lots and broken up. And since 1984, this wing, now circled, known as the lodging block, has been a self-catering holiday let, a landmark as we call it. In 1981, when Landmark acquired the site from the Thornhill estate, the lodging block in the picture at the bottom had been gutted by fire 4 years earlier. The wider grouping had long been subdivided into cottages, with several live tenants still in residence who were allowed to stay. At the time, restoring the lodging block as a Landmark holiday let was therefore the logical thing to do, but it was by no means the oldest nor the most special part of the building. We also wanted to allow people's existing tenancies to play out, and some of you may remember the site from those days. The rest of the site, which included a great hall, a solar block, and a chapel, received only limited restoration at the time and a little clearance, but has been kept weather-tight ever since. And since the last tenancies fell in 2010, it's taken us more than a decade and several false starts to find a workable, imaginative, and above all fundable solution for the site as a whole. This aerial reveals something of the complexity of the shambling building and its many phases. 2 years ago, all except the current Landmark were spaces of bare earth, dusty timbers, and crumbling stone. Since then, archaeology and timber dating have transformed our understanding of it, led by archaeologist Jonathan Clark of York. The site has shape-shifted through its long life, adding and losing stables, barns, dairies, cowsheds, cottages, but this ancient core survived all changes. And the interim date spans you see on the labels here are from ongoing timber analysis being undertaken by Kathy Tyers for Historic England. The earliest portion here is the most hemmed in, and in many ways the most exceptional, an enormous two-storey block that hitherto has always been interpreted as a solar range, in other words, the private rooms for the lord of the household, of the manor. The current Great Hall, this block here, was assumed to have replaced an earlier hall built on a lesser but basically identical footprint. We now know, incredibly, that the core structure of this oldest part, this turns out to be the very oldest part, dates from around 1310, albeit much altered in later centuries. Simultaneously, the chance discovery by our structural engineer of a very early midden heap at the footings of this wall here, coincidentally, he was looking at the footings and discovered, being an alert structural engineer, discovered this vestigial midden heap, would have placed the rubbish tip inside the area of the hypothecated earlier hall. And that obviously made no sense at all. You wouldn't have had a rubbish heap in the middle of your hall. And so that too made us think that it required a rethink. Further unpicking of the fabric has revealed that the earliest part of the solar block, this central area here, was in fact a first floor hall with a coeval timber-framed solar range that extended at right angles through the eventual 1580s lodging block, as per this very crude overlay of the original early 14th century footprint onto the surviving fabric. And we've also found the footings of a lost porch to the rear, which probably held a staircase up to a gallery on the first floor here that gave access to this first floor hall in the central block. And this new phasing has been confirmed by the dating of timbers embedded in the walls of the solar block, and also made sense of the vestigial framing in the late 16th century lodging block, which you see here, which adapted and extended this early solar range. So we have to imagine the solar range extending right through here. And this timber framing had, not been clear what its original purpose had been. I mean, an entrance clearly, but we now know that it's the entrance from the now lost solar range to the first floor hall that became the solar block. Next to be built was the surviving Great Hall, which was built in the late 15th century, when the earlier hall became indeed a solar range with service rooms beneath. In the same generation or so came the chapel, with a private gallery for the family reached from the upper solar block across here. 50 years later, an elegant parlour block was added, apparently in two phases according to the timber dating. So you have a roof from the early decades of the 16th century, but an internal ceiling to the ground floor chamber has been dated at the middle of the 16th century. So that's, a little confusing. It should be said that these are interim dates for now. I mean, firm as far as we can tell, but further sampling may, of course, throw additional light on it and perhaps narrow the date spans as well, the felling date spans. So the last of the Calverley family additions to survive, the lodging block here, was added not in the 17th century as originally thought, but later, but actually in the later 16th century, so the second half of the 16th century. Finally, in this image, we have a sole example of the later cottages that accreted that survives alongside the chapel, built in the 19th or early 20th century. And the whole group is listed grade 1, acknowledging its exceptional importance. But what of the people who built all this? Well, this is just the first 350 years of the Calverley family tree, familiar to some of you perhaps from the printed transcription of the Calverley Charters done by Margerison in 1904 for the Thoresby Society. And you also see the wonderful horned owl and around the escutcheon, which was the Calverley family's coat of arms. The pedigree begins around 1140 with a family called Scott, who eventually took the place name as their surname, and generation on generation of Calverleys follow, the heirs all confusingly called John to begin with, and then subsequently William or Walter. But little by little, key figures in Calverley Old Hall's history come into focus and allow us to populate its rooms with colourful personalities and elegant lives, about whom we are still finding out more. So now I'm going to walk the building through the centuries, bringing each part to life with a member of the Calverley family, people of undoubted status, but always regional rather than national figures. We'll begin with the earliest surviving part, this earliest hall, eventually to be a solar block. And note as I go through this tour, you will always find a graphic top left to help you orientate yourself in the overall grouping. Here is this early hall as a gutted, floorless space after the removal of the later inserted cottages in the 1980s, and as it stood until a couple of years ago. Its roof pitch was altered and the block extended by a bay or so at this end in the late 16th or very early 17th century, to which phase this wonderful many-mullioned window relates. Clearly, as first built in the early 1300s, this was an incredibly grand space. It was probably something like the wonderful surviving example at Mercanfield Hall near Ripon, built in the same years, and the Calverley family indeed married into the Mercanfield family on several occasions. The dates suggest that it was one John Lescott who built this first hall. Later in the century, we have a 1388 clothes bill sent to Joan, wife of that time's Sir Walter de Calverley. Joan had spent the equivalent of £9,000 in today's money on velvet gowns, ermine-lined hoods, and gilded saddles. This painting of ladies of fashion from the 1380s is not of Joan, of course, but we can imagine elegant ladies like this plying their needles and loops in the first hall, warmed by this mighty stone fireplace with service rooms beneath. Now entering the Great Hall, we jump forward another 100 years to the 1480s or so. The 15th century was unsettled, a time of intermittent civil strife during the Wars of the Roses, brought to an end only with the accession of Henry VII in 1485. There is more to be discovered about the role and loyalties of the Calverleys in these decades. No Calverleys fought at Towton, for example. Perhaps they were just keeping their heads down, but it's clear the family continued to prosper. They accumulated land, and they also decided to rebuild a much larger hall. This replacement is still awe-inspiring, construction of the very highest order, a hammer beam roof, fine joinery, and another huge hearth with integral flue, speaking of daily grandeur Note too the original bratishing that survives at cornice level all around along here. The roof was repaired in the 1980s, but many original 15th century timbers remain. The late 15th century was a period for conspicuous religious devotion as well as strife among the wealthy, as religion became a sign of status as well as piety. This painting of Henry VII and his family at prayer while Sir George slays the dragon above suitably represents Sir William Calverley, who added the chapel. He asked in his will for prayers to be said for him there, and bequeathed a silver chalice to the chapel, which, like the Great Hall, has a hammer beam roof, this time in miniature. A private first floor entrance from the solar block, back right, so coming through, you can't really see it, but coming through in this area, led onto a gallery so that the family could watch the priest celebrating Mass and join in with prayers from this private oratory. This gallery's survival seems nothing short of miraculous, given that the chapel was later inhabited as a cottage. The space was cleared and likely restored by Landmark in the 1980s. As we enter Henry VIII's reign, the glimpses of the Calverley family that surface are now of military prowess. The next Sir Walter was knighted by a young Henry VIII in 1513 at Lille after the Battle of Spurs. In 1523, Sir Walter was in Lord Darcy's retinue that fought against the Scots invasion. And it was during this Marshal Sir Walter's lifetime that the parlour block began to take shape, as a taste for more privacy began to supersede communal medieval life. However, this elegant two-storey set of rooms may perhaps have begun life as a stair tower. You'll remember from the aerial view that the timbers have so far been dated to, the roof timbers rather, have so far been dated to 1522 to 34, whereas this surviving moulded ceiling on the ground floor has been dated to 1547 to 61. So there is a discrepancy here. But we return momentarily to the chapel as a reminder that in the 1530s, religious changes were afoot at a national level, as Henry VIII broke with the church in Rome and made himself head of a reformed church in England. An English Bible became mandatory. Everyone was to acknowledge the king as head of the church and observe Protestant forms of worship. It was a massive upheaval in the life and laws of the country, and especially unpopular in the north and east. In 1536 came the serious uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, taking Christ's 5 wounds as its banner shown here. Unrest soon spread to Yorkshire, and a Calverley was among the Yorkshire retinue again summoned by Lord Darcy on behalf of the Crown to put down the rebels. However, the Calverleys were also devout Catholics, and William Calverley, then heir to the estate, was imprisoned in the Tower for his faith in the early 1530s. William renounced his faith in a published dialogue of contrition between the defendant and the plaintiff that has come down to us, but recusancy was to become a defining characteristic of this family later in the century. Young William, however, embraced the new regime wholeheartedly, and he inherited the estate freely at his father's death in 1537. In the 1540s, he may have fought in France on Captain Wallop's expedition. He certainly participated in the so-called Wars of Rough Wooing against Scotland, for he was one of 14 knighted in September 1545 by the Earl of Hertford, leader of Henry VIII's campaign against the Scots at Norham Castle in Northumberland, and he was again in the muster roll in 1548. By now, young Edward VI was on the throne, with his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, holding the reins. In 1549, Sir William was appointed Sheriff of York by this fiercely Protestant regime and reached the highest office of any of the Calverleys. This context is important because we now come to the most exciting of many discoveries during the restoration of Calverley Old Hall. This is the upper room of the parlour block, and it's a nondescript bedroom as we found it, its ceiling in danger of collapse. However, during our routine opening up in 2021, the necessary precursor for any start of works on site, we glimpsed something remarkable through the trial removals of the lathing. Beneath the 19th century lath and plaster, an entire painted chamber of Renaissance wall paintings lay concealed. And this really was a once-in-a-lifetime discovery of national importance, but especially so for Yorkshire and the North, where only a handful of domestic wall paintings survive. This is in marked contrast to south of the Wash, where we now know that wall paintings of some kind were pretty much the default between around 1550 and around 1560 in all but the humblest vernacular dwellings. And here you see, this is obviously one wall. The scheme continues onto the adjacent wall. Why there is this paucity of survivals of wall paintings in the north is unclear. Perhaps Hoskins' great rebuilding came later, so that fashions had changed by then. I'd be interested to hear the group's theories on this. The Calverley painted scheme is clearly remarkable for its completeness, but also for its design motifs, because these are not the cheerfully naive figures we expect from mid to late 16th century work, but instead what is known as grotesque work, laid out in a tightly defined and very sophisticated design scheme. Cruder in execution, perhaps, is the frieze of pomegranates and double Tudor roses you see at the top here at cornice level, combining the white of York and the red of Lancaster. At this date, I do not think it is the white rose of Yorkshire, as has been suggested by some. The use of pomegranates is intriguing to me, since while it was long a symbol of eternal life, this was also Catherine of Aragon's personal motif, who remained devoutly Catholic throughout her life and after she fell from Henry's favour. So it might be a strange motif to find later in the 16th century. But let's consider the remarkable fact of finding such refined grotesque work in 16th century Yorkshire. As you can see, we have elongated laughing beasts. We have a little winged man, there are his wings, with a hat and a kind of balustrade for his body. And we have stacked architectural motifs, fantasies really, known in this context as candelabra. The layout mostly runs carefully to the studwork and is executed in monochrome, except for a vine of life type design that runs down the posts in red oxide. This is quite unlike the sort of work that typically survives even in elite vernacular buildings. And here are a few examples from further south in the country of some of the best of these, where the motifs are similar, but the layout is much freer. And the other point to make about such subject matter is that it's not native. The sources lie in the Italian Renaissance, far away in Rome, in the Emperor Nero's golden palace of Domus Aurea. So reviled was this decadent emperor that at his death, his golden palace was blocked up and buried by the next generation, and so it lay undiscovered until the late 15th century, when the story goes that a young man slipped down a hole on the Oppian Hill. When his friends organised a rescue with torches, by the flickering light, they found to their amazement that they were not in a rough cave, but in a splendid ancient Roman interior, its walls covered in frescoes, which became known as grotteschi, or cave works, grotto being Italian for cave, from which our word grotesque derives. And for all they counted as strictly pagan, these designs were soon copied and widely used as part of the revival of interest in classical architecture in the Italian Renaissance, found in countless 16th century Italian villas and palaces, scenes of fantasy creatures and elongated objects laid out to fit a built space. So how did such themes find their way to Yorkshire in a century when Rome had become highly suspect to the Protestant regime? The answer lies in the importance of printed sources at the time. Almost immediately, the grotteschi were disseminated through books of engravings and soon found their way to Northern Europe and the Low Countries, and thence to England. And I'm indebted here to Anthony Wells Cole for these examples of printed sources from the mid-16th century, which illustrate the point perfectly for Calverley. The Wilbourn print, especially the one in the middle here, illustrates a figure very close to the laughing griffin-type creature at Calverley. We cannot know whether the painter Stainer, who decorated the chamber at Calverley, carried his own copy of such works, or whether it was Sir William who showed him his. But without doubt, it perhaps unexpectedly reveals that the Calverleys moved in circles of a high culture and taste. In choosing to instruct his chamber to be painted in such a style, Sir William was not only displaying his own erudition, but also expecting his friends to appreciate it with him. This was his inner sanctum, and significantly, it was only reached via the first floor and had a private entrance to the chapel. The only truly comparable painted scheme I've been able to find is this one in the Dean's house beside Westminster Abbey. Nothing is known about the execution of this scheme either, but soon after Westminster Abbey's dissolution in 1540, the house was in the ownership of Thomas Wentworth, 1st Baron Wentworth, and it sought it to date from around 1550. This scheme has been quite heavily restored in the 19th century, and horror has been varnished. The picture, I'm afraid, it's very hard to photograph because the light is deliberately kept low in this room. And I may be biased, but to my eye, this scheme, even this scheme in this, at Westminster Abbey, does not quite have the refinement of the Calverley scheme. And was the Calverley scheme commissioned by Sir William Calverley in the mid-century, or is there a chance it could be earlier? As I've mentioned, Sir William bought wholeheartedly into the Henrician regime after his scare imprisonment in the Tower, and Henry VIII, as a young man, wholeheartedly embraced continental influences. To my eye, the Calverley scheme has something of the delicacy of the English Renaissance work of the 1520s and 30s. On the right here, we see the title page of William's retraction of his religious views after his imprisonment. The pamphlet is not dated, and no date has yet been found for William's imprisonment, but it must have occurred around the time of the break with Rome in 1534 and the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, by when William is on the crown side. The border on the title page is very similar in style to the painted scheme we find on the walls at Calverley. So in a sense, this proves a direct link, not necessarily with the precise design, but a direct link of William's knowledge of Renaissance form at this relatively early date. I should say, however, that this stylistic theory for an earlier date does run counter to the timber sample so far of the moulded ceiling in the parlour block, which is considered coeval with the painted scheme. The timber date ranges are frustratingly wide given how eventful these decades were at a national level. If the Calverley paintings should turn out to date from the 1520s, or even the 1530s, or even the 1520s, and we might remember the pomegranates in this context, this would make them even more remarkable. Either way, the Calverley painted chamber lay undiscovered after it was covered with wainscoting in the 17th century, which helps account for its wonderful state of preservation. It is a truly exceptional discovery, not just for Yorkshire, but at a national level. We shall be gently conserving rather than restoring the paintings, and very much hope to leave them revealed in the bedroom that this room will become after restoration. But let's drag ourselves back to the history of Calverley Old Hall itself. Sir William, erstwhile Sheriff of York, died in 1572. Even though he had no fewer than 17 children with his 2 wives, the next phase of evolution, the construction of the lodging block, probably belongs to the next generation. And here you see the lodging block in its most recent incarnation as the landmark holiday let. In the bedroom, there is the timber framing that now makes sense of the vestigial embedded timbers of the 1310 original first floor hall, and the adaptation and extension of that earlier structure also accounts for the unusual L-shaped room on the ground floor. And in this next generation, we at last have a portrait of someone who lived at Calverley Old Hall. This is Anne Danby, wife of Sir William's son and heir, Walter Calverley, who inherited in 1572. Walter was still a figure of local influence, but he, and especially Anne, remained fiercely Catholic. This placed them more and more at odds with the Elizabethan regime. The family was now subject to ongoing fines for refusing to acknowledge Elizabeth as head of the church and for their Catholic ways of worship. For this, Walter was one of 3 given as the worst sort in a list of 31 principal gentlemen in the West Riding, submitted to William Cecil in September 1572. Sir Walter and Anne's eldest son, William, shown here as a youth, married Catherine Thornhome, a particularly pious woman whose family was also Catholic. Unfortunately, as an adult, William's own religious fervour combined with mental instability, and this brought him to the authorities' notice. He was imprisoned for his unguarded faith several times, but the authorities humanely attributed his rash expression of Catholic zeal to his extraordinary melancholic lunacy, and he was always released back into his family's care. Even greater disaster struck the next generation. On the 16th of April, 1605, William's son and heir, Walter, who perhaps inherited his father's emotional instability, was overwhelmed with despair at his own debts and hatred of his wife, whom he believed was unfaithful. At the Old Hall, he stabbed to death 2 of their small sons, violently attacked his wife in her chamber, and threw her maid downstairs. A 3rd baby son, Henry, survived only because he was at his wet nurse's house and because his murderous father was arrested before he could reach him. This so-called Yorkshire tragedy became a national scandal, and a lurid play and pamphlets were written about it. The play was first published as William Shakespeare's work, but it's now attributed to Thomas Middleton. At his trial, Walter refused to plead either guilty or innocent, which meant he could not be convicted by a jury and carried the penalty of being literally pressed to death under heavy weights for his crime. Walter's reason for undergoing this terrible death seems to have been that as an unconvicted criminal, his property would remain with his family instead of passing to the Crown. These tragic events cast a shadow over the old hall, from which the family perhaps never fully recovered. The building is now too gutted ever to know exactly where the murders took place, but if you're interested to know more about the affair, you might like to seek out my blog on the Landmark website. The third baby, Henry, who escaped his father's wrath, grew up and inherited in 1623. The estate limped on, but once again national events intervened as the disputes between Charles I and his parliaments spilled over into the Civil War of the 1640s. Yorkshire, of course, did not escape the violence, and Leeds fell to the parliamentarians in 1643. Henry Calverley fought for the king, and once more heavy fines were imposed on the estate, this time by Oliver Cromwell's Committee for Compounding. Henry had to sell large parts of the Calverley lands to pay these fines. He died in 1651, leaving his son, another Walter, with a great deal of debt. But back in favour after the Restoration, in 1665, Walter married heiress Frances Thompson of Esholt Hall, just a few miles away from Calverley, which they now made the main family seat. And you can see the Calverley owl reproduced on the downpipes and indeed above the main entrance. Walter's son, another Walter, married an even wealthier heiress, Julia Blackett of Wallington Hall in Northumberland, a classic alliance of ancient family with newer wealth from the coalfields. From 1706 to 1709, Walter and Julia rebuilt Esholt Hall into an elegant mansion. The family had left medieval Calverley Old Hall for good, and the ancient seat was now no more than a tenanted estate building. From then on, every part of the old hall was adapted as cottages, let to local people working in farming or the cloth industry. The changes can be read in the windows inserted into the end wall of the Great Hall. The large central opening, now partially blocked, perhaps a window for taking in cloth or wool bales. In 1750, Sir Walter Calverley Blackett sold the old hall to Thomas Thornhill of Fixby, and the Calverley family's long association with the site came to an end. This 19th century photo makes clear the extent of the colonisation of tenanted cottages that then took place, as indeed does the 1960s one. Even the chapel became a dwelling, so this is the chapel tucked in here, and a further cottage was built onto its east elevation, which has now gone, but here you see that extra cottage in the 1960s. Even though the lodging block was pulled back from the brink by Landmark in 1984, and the rest of the shell kept weathertight ever since, Calverley Old Hall has always been unfinished business for Landmark. In 2020, as the maintenance mounted and vandals took their toll, the site was even put on the Buildings at Risk register. Action was indeed the imperative to bring the whole site back into productive use. But how to restore a site as ancient and compromised as this? The scene was set for our restoration by Landmark's philosophy of repair, which is something we do for every restoration project we take on. It was agreed, as usual, only after extensive building analysis and reinterpretation and consultation with Historic England, who were finally willing to accept the removal of the cottage walls within the Great Hall. So we set out to prioritise the successful functioning of the entire grouping in sustainable use, while very importantly striving to remain sympathetic to the history and character of the site. Secondly, we seek to alter the external appearance as little as possible. Internally, we prioritise the retention of fabric and the recovery of volumes that existed before around the middle of the 17th century, when the Calverley family left it as a main seat and it fell into humbler use. We acknowledge but do not seek to reverse decisions made during the 1980s restoration to clear later interventions from part of the hall grouping and restoration of the chapel. So what that means is that we place those clearly on record, but we're not about to try and rebuild the cottages in any way that colonize the interior spaces of the solar block and the Great Hall. And it's important to stress here that for all the 21st century reimagining that's been going on, the resulting scheme is highly respectful of the surviving fabric. The exterior will indeed look hardly different. The interior conversion, as you'll see, will sit lightly within the walls and allow the archaeology of the old hall to be read. But this philosophy of repair then formed the basis for the brief for an international architectural competition in 2018, won by Cowper Griffiths Architects of Cambridge. So the resulting scheme is a creative and contemporary reimagining of the site, in which respect for these ancient spaces combines the best in environmentally friendly contemporary design. There'll be a new landmark holiday let for 10 people, which bring back the Great Hall and the solar block into use. And the income from this use is what will maintain the site to make sure it never becomes dilapidated again. We'll make sure that there are regular and free public open days so that locals and others can enjoy exploring the whole site too. The lodging block will now become a residential flat as a home for a local family, and also on its ground floor a space for flexible community and meeting use. And thanks to our lottery funding, we've been offering an enormous raft of craft training and work experience opportunities as part of the restoration project. And as a result of our taster courses, 2 new masonry apprentices have joined our main contractors, who are Dobsons of Ilkley. And we'll have an ongoing programme of exciting activities with the emphasis on cross-cultural links and influences. And to give you a very quick overview of the design scheme, this is the ground floor, and you can see here's the Great Hall, which becomes a kind of goes back to almost its function as it would have been in the Middle Ages, really, a kitchen, dining room, and sitting area. Then in what would have been the screen's passage, we have a staircase and a lift for the less mobile, and the rest of the ground floor of the solar block gets converted into bedrooms and a couple of bathrooms, easy access bedrooms and bathrooms on the ground floor. The lodging block at this end, the existing landmark, this ground floor becomes a flexible space for the community and occasional landmark meeting use and so on, but will be available for wider uses. Another bedroom on the ground floor here, on the ground floor of the parlour block, and the chapel remains as a space for peaceful reflection, and really much as it is, really unchanged. It's a very special, ancient feeling space, the chapel, that we really don't want to do anything to at all. And then on the first floor, so the upper space of the Great Hall remains simply open to the roof timbers, so that you get a sense of that wonderful original volume. This is a 17th century wall and chimney breast, which it felt over-intrusive, over-interventionist to remove. And in fact, it provides quite a useful purpose in screening off the stairs, which lead up to a landing on the first floor that in a sense mimics the porch that would, the external stair that would once have come up here in the early 14th century, as we saw on the earlier slide. And upstairs in the solar block, we kind of reinstate the earliest first floor hall as a wonderful light sitting area. The painted chamber here, we hope to make a bedroom. I mean, we're still deep in discussions about environmental controls to ensure the stability of the wall paintings, but that is certainly our aspiration. And another bedroom over here. But then at this end, you have the residential let, the AST, for the upper floor of the lodging block. So to get a sense of how the spaces will look, here's the Great Hall as it was at the beginning of works. And here is an architect's visualization of how it might look with this enormous 17th century chimney breast, with all its signs to be read of the cottage, that a first floor cottage half there, for example, another that's been inserted here. That big wall remains. Obviously, the wonderful fireplace remains. The roof timbers are there to be inspected. And here's someone standing at the first floor gallery doing just that. The huge first floor of the solar block will effectively return to its original purpose. You'll be able to inspect the detailing of the early roof here, which includes these wonderful carved spandrels, as I've dropped one in here just as an example. And leading off this space is the open gallery, an echo of the original entrance to the first floor hall. And as I've said, from here, you'll be given a fantastic view of the 1480s hammer beam roof structure. And we hope that the building as revealed will prove fascinating, not least for anyone interested in vernacular architecture. And just finally, I wanted to share with you another remarkable aspect of our work at Calverley Old Hall, and that's the sheer number of concealed objects we found in the building as work has gone on. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with such apotropaic objects in vernacular buildings, concealed as good luck charms or markings, placed under the eaves or beside openings like doors or chimneys. It's thought to deter evil spirits. Typically, if you're lucky, you might find one or two in an old house, perhaps an old shoe or a child's dress. It's thought they worked on the principle of sympathetic magic, conferring protection on the concealer. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is folk magic and we don't really know for sure. But what is remarkable at Calverley is that we have found literally dozens of such objects, concealed in places they could not have reached by chance, often seemingly when an alteration was being made to the building. Even allowing for the multiple dwellings, their quantity is staggering. And you'll see here, for example, a lot of iron objects, which were believed to repel witches, both through sharpness and because of their magnetic qualities. Other fragments help us to understand the original richness of the interiors, like these plaster fragments, which hint at a ribbed plaster ceiling, and perhaps on the left, a scrap of a heraldic beast made out of plaster. Others bring the occupants and their clothing to life for us, like these scraps of fabric, blue and white gingham, a cotton bonnet, a moleskin garment, a cotton sleeve, a linen garment with a button. And I particularly like this one, which is a tie-on pocket, such as might have been tied around your waist under an apron with a key still inside. And you can see such an object in Broyville's Peasant Dance, if anyone knows that painting. And we found many shoes, including these particularly well-preserved children's ones, in which first steps would have been taken. And then there are everyday objects, a bobbin, a tobacco pipe bowl, a knotted string bag, a woven basket, all tucked into impossibly hidden crevices that they must have been placed deliberately. And we have many fragments of pottery, including this stoneware bottle. And it's possible that this is a so-called witch bottle, which was typically concealed, containing urine or some other liquid, often also with hair or sharp objects like nail clippings or iron nails inside. And again, remember, I must stress that all these objects have been found in places within the fabric that could not be accidental, inside the cavities at the core of walls, up chimneys, above door lintels. They're worthless fragments and leftovers at one level, but the act of concealment imbued them with protective powers, so thought their concealers, and give them added significance for us too. Such traditions were at their height in the 17th century, but lingered on well into the late 19th century. What prompted such intensity of concealment at Calverley? We can only speculate, but the most likely explanation can only be the lingering folk memory of the dreadful events of April 1605 and the Calverley murders. As George Lambert's wonderful grimoire or spell book of 1707 testifies, it seems that belief in magic was alive and well in Yorkshire, and nowhere more so than Calverley Old Hall. And that brings my talk to a close. I do hope you will all come and see Calverley Old Hall for yourself once restoration is completed. We can't allow any access on site while the works are in progress, but we do have an open day on the 3rd of June and hopefully others later in the autumn of this year as well. So of necessity, during works going on site, numbers for tours of the building itself on open days have to be strictly limited. So if you will need to book a free place via the Landmark website, if you would like to come to those open days, and they'll be posted there very soon. You can also sign up for project updates by emailing the email address given there. And certainly once the building reopens and restoration is complete, there will be several open weekends every year when access will be free and unrestricted. So I do hope you'll come. Thank you very much for listening.